Hey, Bird, y'all need to come and get this junk off this walkway. It's in the way. Move it tonight. 1061, Postilion.
Saying that he was, quote, going to take care of it. The Federal Aviation Administration and Coast Guard worked to clear the airspace and water below the balloon as it reached the ocean earlier today. In the Northeast, more than 20 million people are continuing to feel the effects of this Arctic blast, with many states experiencing temperatures well below zero. Wind chill warnings and advisories across Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut are likely to continue through tomorrow. Last night, a new national off the Carolina coast. This move comes just 2 days after it was first spotted flying over Montana above sensitive nuclear military sites. President Joe Biden spoke to reporters earlier today saying that he was, quote, going to take care of it. And after extending a ground stop at 3 airports in North and South Carolina, the FAA says airspace is open again in the area. Turning to politics, the Democratic Party is shaking
life, and the requested money can be sent back over to the Democrat stronghold in order to help them get out the vote. As an example of how this worked in practice, according to the report, the Center for Tech and Civic Life gave $100,000 of Zuckerberg money to Mr. Corey Mason, who is the mayor of Racine, Wisconsin, in order to have him go to 4 other cities in the area, and specifically those cities were all Democrat strongholds, and in those cities, he recruited the local leaders there, helped them to develop a plan, and then they sent in a request to the Center for Tech and Civic Life for a larger grant in order to execute on that plan. And indeed, the Zuckerberg money just kept rolling in. According to the report, back in June of 2020, which is now 5 months before the actual election itself, the cities of Milwaukee, Madison, Green Bay, Racine, as well as Kenosha, they submitted their plans, and then they subsequently received approximately $9 million to implement those plans. Now, if you are a generous person, you might look at that situation and say, hey, you know what? That sounds like a good thing. The Center for Tech and Civic Life is just using Mark Zuckerberg's money to help out the election officials, subsidize their work, and make elections better, while at the same time saving taxpayers money. Sounds like a good thing, which could have been the case, at least in theory. However, according to the report by the Thomas More Society, the money flowed overwhelmingly to Democrat strongholds by a ratio of about 10 to 1. Meaning that for every $10 that went to a Democrat stronghold, only $1 was spent in a Republican area. Here's specifically what the report said on this front. Quote, Mark Zuckerberg's money allowed these Democrat strongholds to spend roughly $47 per voter compared to $4 to $7 per voter in traditionally Republican areas of the state. And the big question that has been hanging in the air since the year 2020 is whether this was actually legal or not. Because according to the Help America Vote Act, which you can see up on screen for yourself, it requires that state election plans must be submitted to the federal government for approval. Specifically, they must be approved to make sure that all resources are available equally to all voters. And so that is the full background on this new report, which dropped over in the state of Wisconsin, which, as I mentioned earlier, determined that Mark Zuckerberg's election money did, in fact, violate Wisconsin state election laws in respect to bribery. And so what this new report says is that Mark Zuckerberg, as well as his wife, Ms. Priscilla Chan, they provided financing that allowed the Center for Tech and Civic Life to specifically, quote, offer nearly $9 million in Zuckbucks to Milwaukee, Madison, Racine, Kenosha, and Green Bay counties in exchange. The Zuckerberg Five, as the report called these 5 counties, in effect operated Democratic get-out-the-vote efforts. Those grant funds then paid for illegal drop boxes to be placed in Democrat voting strongholds. And in regards to the drop boxes that they mentioned, this was another area of concern that the report highlighted as well. Because according to Wisconsin state election laws, Wisconsin citizens, otherwise, by the way, known as Wisconsinites, they are limited to casting ballots either in person or by mail unless they have some very special circumstances, making ballot drop boxes in and of themselves unconstitutional. In fact, this time last year, the state Supreme Court of Wisconsin, they upheld a ban on these drop boxes for the primary elections. Although in that particular ban, it was not permanent, but it was a tacit acknowledgement that those boxes were very likely unconstitutional, which is what the report states as well. However, getting back to the Mark Zuckerberg portion and the portion about his money, the report goes on to say that the Zuckerberg Five, which again refer to those 5 different counties that we laid out earlier, they violated the, quote, federal and state constitutional guarantee of equal protection. The grant money targeted specific voters for special voting privileges to the disadvantage of similarly situated voters located in other Wisconsin counties. Now, in this regard, the report actually then went on to detail evidence of how these 5 counties allowed private groups working with the granting organization, which is, of course, the Center for Tech and Civic Life, to, quote, unlawfully administer aspects of the election, including in one county where one organization was unlawfully embedded in local government election administration. Just consider the implications there. This sub-organization that's connected to the Center for Tech and Civic Life, which itself is an organization staffed primarily by progressive, I imagine, Democrats, is being actually embedded into the election system to help out. Now, there were other issues that were highlighted in this report as well, such as how, for one, the Wisconsin Elections Commission issued illegal directives which allowed local officials to ignore the actual laws that were on the books governing the elections within nursing homes. Now, we actually did discuss that aspect in greater detail. However, this report also went on to say that non-citizens were allowed to remain on Wisconsin voting rolls despite the fact that this was against the law. And the report goes on, listing problem after problem like this that were discovered in the 2020 election. But the best part is that this report, even though it's several months old, well, these problems have yet to be fixed. Meaning that if you live in the state of Wisconsin at least, well, reading this report will give you an idea of what you have to look forward to in the upcoming presidential race in 2024. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed. Most important.
Migrants on private property. We will hear about the devastating effects, as I said earlier, of fentanyl.
This is a sham.
So what would you like to see a hearing on the border consist of? What do you think is necessary to talk about right now in regards to the border?
Proper policies. But this whole nonsense about the open border, that the Biden administration's open border, it's just not true.
And with the two parties miles apart on finding solutions, some lawmakers are now trying to decouple the issue. For example, Representative Abigail Spanberger, who is a Democrat who just won re-election in the swing district of Virginia, saying we can decouple the discussions of people and humanity and workers and families from the very real truth that indeed there are transnational criminal organizations that are trafficking fentanyl and making billions of dollars a year trafficking vulnerable people. And Spanberger is not alone here. This is a message that we heard from many Democrats during Wednesday's hearing. Here's a look.
We've heard that what we really need is comprehensive immigration reform. That is a question separate and apart from securing the border, which is about enforcing the laws that we already have.
While some other lawmakers have tried to take the exact opposite approach by writing bills that would provide funding for border security while at the same time providing immigration reform, such as providing a pathway to citizenship for dreamers or reforms to the asylum process. But it's unclear how much support bills like this would get on Capitol Hill.
Well, what we've seen for the last several years is that we've attempted to do that, and border security funding has ramped up over and over again. I think that we need a lot more than just the asylee process.
And while House Speaker McCarthy has called on DHS Secretary Mayorkas to resign, Republican leadership has not officially started that process to impeach him. Here's what Congressman Jim Jordan told me just yesterday.
It's a decision we'll make as Republicans on the committee and as a conference. So I've been very clear about that. I haven't called for it. He certainly warrants it, but whether we will, move in that direction is going to be determined by Republican members of the Judiciary Committee in consultation with the Speaker in the Republican caucus.
What do you think, Mike?
And Jordan tells me lawmakers will be headed to the border in just a few weeks for that on-site border hearing. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf.
For governor in Indiana in 2024, with Sparks' announcement, the race for the senator's seat seems to be opening up for Banks. Representative Sparks will work through the current term. She says she's leaving to spend more time with her family. When Sparks was elected to the House in 2020, she became the first Ukrainian-born member of Congress. A man in New York State has pled guilty to threatening Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Joseph Morelli made calls to Greene's office and left at least 7 violent voicemails. In the voicemails, he described how he would physically hurt Greene or pay someone to do so. Authorities said the voicemails also contained threats against law enforcement. Morelli was charged by federal prosecutors with 3 counts of interstate threatening communications. He pled guilty to all 3. The judge is allowing him to be released on home confinement. Prosecutors say he faces up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $250,000. The sentencing is scheduled for June 1st. The January jobs.
Philadelphia, Biden boasted about helping create millions of jobs, saying his administration had made the most significant federal investments in public works, healthcare, and green technology in decades. The president's State of the Union address is set for early next week, with Biden once again calling for political unity. Back in Washington, the president faces increasing pressure as a special counsel investigates how classified documents turned up in his home and former office. An opinion that overturned Roe v. Wade. Sources say some Supreme Court justices often use their own personal email accounts instead of secure servers to send sensitive information. And some court employees used printers that did not produce tracking logs. There's also been cases of so-called burn bags used to ensure the safe destruction of materials left open and unattended in the hallways. In last month's report on the draft opinion leak, the Supreme Court marshal said the court's method to destroy sensitive material has issues that should be addressed. Firefighters from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia worked together to get the fire under control. Now officials are issuing a shelter-in-place order for the 5,000 people who live nearby, while the EPA monitors the air quality in the area. At this time, crews are still investigating what was on the train when it went off the track. Turning now, known members of a local gang allegedly killed 6 people in the central California town of Goshen last month. And an area sheriff says the murders are likely tied to the group's violent conflict with a rival gang. One of them is accused of murdering a 16-year-old mother and her 10-month-old child as she tried to save her baby. On Friday, the Tulare County Sheriff's Office served 3 search warrants during what it called Operation Nightmare. ATF says it resulted in a shootout before law enforcement took the 2 men into custody. And unattended in the hallways. In last month's report on the draft opinion leak, the Supreme Court marshal said the court's method to destroy sensitive material has issues that should be addressed. Some loud video there. We're looking at a new possible national record for lowest wind chill ever recorded. Take a look. One brave weather observer at the Mount Washington Observatory stepped out into wind gusts of over 105 miles per hour. A reading of minus 108 degrees was reported Friday night. Looks like he's having trouble standing here. At the time, the observatory was recording an actual temperature of 46 below zero, with wind gusts up to 127 miles an hour. Most meteorologists believe 105 below zero in Alaska previously stood as the lowest ever recorded wind chill. Mount Washington's cold readings now come among a new blast of Arctic temperatures sweeping across the Northeast. More than 20 million people are still under wind chill advisories across 6 states from Maine to Connecticut. Most of New York and parts of Pennsylvania are also dealing with extremely low temperatures, but we can expect a bit of a warming to arrive tomorrow. Be sure to stick with our NewsNet weather team as they...
Crimes happening. We're obviously not fixing the issue. It doesn't matter to me whether it's black on black, white on black, white on white.
Anything that's violence related needs to be brought to attention.
I don't see it personally. So.
If you give things more attention, then more of it will continue.
Don't focus on the effect so much on black crime, but just the cause. Not just the school education system, but the household education.
It's too much of us being against each other.
It needs attention for real.
And now we see a lot of crimes in the city.
Make the streets more safer.
Any crime should have an equal amount of coverage.
All the races.
I think all crime needs to be more paid attention to.
I think if done carefully.
I think all crime deserves more attention in this country, not just specifically black on black.
Very important issue.
They'll be more motivated in society today. They'll be bringing them the attention that they need.
It definitely should. I know there's ways to prevent it for sure.
I believe that Black lives will matter to others when it matters to us.
who lost her son, Dre Charles, 3 years ago this month to street violence. Zanetta, I know it's not easy for you to talk about this, so thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
Start off by telling us a little bit about Dre Charles and what happened that day 3 years ago.
Dre Charles, we normally call him Dre, fun-loving, outgoing, just free-spirited person. Always laugh.
National Guard is to blame, and some fear that the Guardsmen might stop protesters from assembling peacefully. For the second straight day, protesters took to the streets of downtown Atlanta Saturday. The afternoon protest and march at Centennial Olympic Park comes hours after a Friday night demonstration there.
Put the killer cops away. We want convictions for all 5 of them.
Addison Clapp is part of the group that organized the 2 protests. The organization says more people would have come out if it weren't for Governor Brian Kemp declaring a state of emergency and calling up the National Guard in response to the violent riot last weekend.
I had many people tell me they were scared to come out tonight, and that's outrageous that people are scared to speak out against police terror.
This is an attempt to scare people from protesting when it's actually critically important that people are protesting right now.
On Saturday, Georgia NAACP President Gerald Griggs was among the peaceful protesters. He said bringing in the National Guard was unnecessary as people hit the streets to demand change.
The proper response to what happened in Memphis and what happened in Atlanta is conversation, not militarization.
The Georgia chapter of the ACLU shared a similar message. In a statement, their policy and advocacy director wrote in part, quote, "We believe people in Georgia should be able to freely express their First Amendment right to protest the police violence that killed Tyree Nichols. The right to protest should not have to take place in a militarized environment," end quote.
And to my understanding, there was a young man that walked up and actually shot him in the back. And he didn't stop shooting when he shot him that one time. He continued to shoot him. I remember getting the call from my sister saying that something had happened to him and she was in a panic. When I arrived at the hospital, it was cold. It was just so cold. It was nobody there. And I'm looking around like, okay, maybe, just maybe, there was a mistake. When they finally did make it with him, they rolled him in, and I remember it was like time stopped. And I was trying to keep it together. I was praying, but couldn't pray. By the time my husband got there, they called us to the back, and it was like, again, time stopped. So when we went to the back, we standing in the middle of the hallway, and the doctor looked at us. It was like they all stopped, doctors, nurses, everybody, in their tracks to say, as if they're thinking in their heads, they didn't want to tell us what they had to tell us. But the doctor looked at us and just told us, in the middle of the hall, he didn't make it. And all my husband and I could do at that moment was say, where is he? Just let me see him. And when we walked in the room, he looked like his normal handsome self, sleeping. Other than his eyes were half open. And my husband closed his eyes. And I brushed dirt from his mustache. And I loved on him and I hugged on him. And I was able to still just feel him while he was still warm. And I was able to tell him how much I loved him right then. Everybody was out waiting for us. So what we did was we quickly tried to go out and just let everybody know. And it was like everybody went, wow.
Who would have thought that it took Miss Universe to declare the war on women? Right. I mean, it's so sad what we're seeing An organization which, when I was Miss California, I ran for Miss USA, I had to sign a contract saying that I was naturally born female. Look how far we've come. And now we're seeing the Miss Universe organization being a weaponized vessel to disempower women and eliminate women and erase women altogether. It's really sad. And I want to empower all women to rise up and stand up against this. This is not okay.
Think about this as well. Men have smaller hips than women do, for obvious biological reasons. Women have hips to bear children. Therefore, a man who has surgically transitioned to a woman may actually have a biological advantage in a beauty contest, as curvier women might be edged out. In this respect, it won't be feminism being championed, but menimism. Yes, menimism. Understand? Women will now not just be competing against each other, women, for totally subjective beauty standards, but also against men who look like them. This will fuel an inferiority complex in women, whereby they will seek to be unique for various identity issues like gender expression or even sexual orientation, rather than a platform in order to win. And by the way, what's the prize? This new $5 million tiara? What about a scholarship? What about an internship with a major media corporation? From what I can gather, the prize package is not great and requires Miss Universe to move to Thailand, where some 600,000 people have been trafficked. Where's that mentioned in the Miss Universe PR materials? And next year's pageant will be held in El Salvador, a place that is absolutely rife with drug and gang activity. It's the origin of the deadly MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs. 2% of the adult population is in jail there. Is that honestly the best host country? But remember, NBC broke their ties with Trump because he said that some of these countries were not sending their best. So you're going to put 80 or more of the best-looking women in the world in that country? J.K. Rowling, author of the Harry Potter books, said, quote, "If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and I love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth," unquote. And that's quite true. It isn't hate to recognize that our differences are unique and should be championed as such. So what do you think?